Hello. I'm going to work in my art journal today, and I'm working onto an acrylic painting paper. It's designed for acrylic paints. I'm using some vintage photo ink, and I'm just wetting that with some tea and just inking around the edge, but I have quite a lot left over, so just decide to paint that onto my page to give it a bit of background colour. Just mopping up the excess, drying it, and I've got this vintage ledger with some vintage Greek writing in, where somebody's been learning the language, and I just tear a piece of that out for my background. Now, what I did decide is I was going to keep this quite minimalistic and very plain. It didn't really happen. Less is more occasionally, but I tend to be more is more when I'm doing this kind of art journaling. So I'm just applying some matte medium, and I'm applying it to both sides so I can move it around a little bit just if I don't stick it in the right place, and just giving that push down, cleaning my board a little bit, and just applying some matte medium over the top of that as well. So give that a bit of a dry, and I get out my paints. They're Artiste acrylics, and I'm using two kind of colour greens and a bronze, and I put way too much paint onto my palette and just really dry brush some on here and there. I'm not too worried, I just want a little bit of colour showing through, just get rid of a little bit of that with a dry tissue. This is from a gardening book, and I've got some, that's muslin, I think. Tear a piece of that off, and I think I now reach for some music paper, take a piece of that too. And it's the same as, I mean, this would work on a journal tag. This is just basic collaging. There's, not a lot to this, just basic collaging, bit of paint, bit of gesso, and just laying down that muslin there. So I've got a book that I've taken apart, and I'm just trying to find out some images that I might want to use in the piece of work. I think I pull out 3, and I lay them out and try and decide which one I might like to use, but I can't decide. So what I do is I just tear out the pieces so I can get a better idea of what it's going to look like if it's on the page. So I know this is really fast, but otherwise it would be a really boring video. If it's too fast, let me know, and I'll try and do it slower if I do any more of these. So I decide I'm going to edge it while I'm kind of considering which piece of book page I'm going to use as my image. So that's just tea stained. I'm using my little glue, it's the shimmer glue, so I can get a little edge, can get around those little edges and just press that down. It doesn't stick all the way, so I grab my matte medium and just kind of tuck some under and give that a coating on the top as well. Just matte medium again to glue down my book pages and my music sheet, and I also use the matte medium to hold down the muslin. So I just put a little crease in that to give it a bit of texture, and then apply some medium underneath there to hold that down a bit more securely and give it a coat over the top. And of course I'm going to dry it. So this is where I get out my Stays On ink, and I take a couple of background stamps, and I grab that kind of brick effect, and I think it's supposed to be text, but it's so small you can't really tell. And I just do some stamping with the black. I have decided that I'd like some black in this, so that's why I decided to use the black Stays On. And dry that off before I give that a coat of gesso. I kind of apply several thin coats of gesso, just so, because it dries a lot lighter, I can decide if I've got enough or not, and it's just easier to add another coat than it is to remove some if you've applied too much. So dry that off. I decide that I need some more gesso, so I can add some more, and I really use a dry brush to do this, and I like the effect you get when you dry brush gesso onto fabric. I think I might have said that before, but I do really like that. So it's quite pale. I get out the images again to now really decide which one I'm going to use, and I do go for the moths from the book page, so it takes up a bit more of the page. And I also use some of that embossed scraps that I've got. And this is, I've used the archival potting compost ink for this, and the Tim Holtz, I think they're wallflower stamps, just to give this a little bit more of a back down texture. Now this is probably along the area where I should have stopped, because I quite like the effect I was getting here. Don't get me wrong, I kind of like how it turned out, but I liked it at this point too. I thought that was matte medium, but I actually applied some gesso, so I just dry that off, and now I can actually apply my matte medium and just pop down that little embossed piece, and then my book page. And again, I'm applying it to the back of the page so I can move it around if I need to, and then I give that a good coating of matte medium over the top and dry that off. So now I'm getting out my gesso. I don't necessarily want the middle of the book page completely covered, so I remove some of the gesso with a tissue and a baby wipe, I think, and just give that a dry. And I'm kind of happy with how that turns out. This is where it starts to go horribly wrong. I grab my stamp, and I've got a little tin of words, bits and pieces that I've cut out of book pages, and I take out a couple that I might want to use. I decide on one, and then I decide I'm going to stamp that into the middle of my page. Now there's a lot of texture on here, so you can guess what's going to happen. It looks pants. So what I decide to do is I'm going to add a layer on top of my piece, and obviously that's very white at the moment, so I'm just going to do a small amount of collaging on there, ink the edges, give it a bit of a spray with my tea, and then dry that off and just collage onto it in a similar way that I did on the main background page. So it's just a little bit of that script that was left, that ledger paper and some music paper. I use the matte medium to put that down. And of course I'm going to give it a little coat of matte medium over the top, and then I'll dry that off. So of course gesso's next, so it ties in with the main piece, the main background. Take some of that off and give it a dry, and now I'm going to stamp onto this piece where of course there's still texture. It's not quite as much, so it's not a perfect impression, but I like it. There's kind of a couple of lines across it. I like it. So I dry the stays on, and then I decide I'm going to add black around the edges of that to kind of make it pop off the page. So now I decide I need to pull it together. So I just have a little play around with where I want things added. But like I said, I've decided that I need to kind of tie in that background. So I go round the piece with the stays on, the black. I didn't want to dull it down. I quite like the black, and I go around the words as well, which says garden creatures. I just cut it in half, and I just sort of play around with where I'm going to add them. Still not quite sure. So I get out my Mars Black acrylic paint. I just add a tiny amount of water to that. It's just off frame, so but that's what I'm doing, adding a tiny amount of water. And I'm using a hard bristle brush and just doing some really light splatters on there. They're not very dark at all. It's just bringing in that black really. Just cleaning off my hands. Okay, so now I just take a lid from a small spray bottle and just paint a few circles on there, and I decide I need a couple on the butterfly as well. So I'm adding that. Now I think this is where yeah, I've decided to use Fabri-Tac, but I tried to use my heat gun and it's not working. When it gets a bit hot, it just decides it's not working anymore. So I do Fabri-Tac this on because I want this to stick fairly well. It's a quite heavy paper, but I have to be careful because the paint is obviously still wet. So I'm just using a tissue to help me hold that down. And again, I'm using Fabri-Tac to just hold down the little words that I've added and decide where I'm going to place them. And I think I end up being reasonably happy with where I added the words. Overall, I think I probably went a little bit too far with the piece. There were a couple of places I should have stopped. So I decided to add that to the second page because there's a butterfly on the front cover, so I don't want the first image to be a butterfly too. So I go to the second page and I'm just literally blending in a small amount of vintage photo ink just to take the whiteness off that page. And I'm not going to glue it in yet because, like I said, the paint is still wet. I do think about it, but I decide not to. So that's the piece. I hope you enjoyed this little art journal with me. Thanks again. Bye.